This is Tipping Point Radio. I'm Craig Merriweather, and you're listening to Emergence. There's a time when every crisis can become transformation, when simply surviving can become joyous thriving. We can solve our problems based upon the way we think of ourselves and the world. It's our willingness to think differently about ourselves and the world that will be the key to the success of our journey. From the relationships in our own lives, our health, and our own finances, to peak oil, failing world economies, and climate change, it's clear that our lives and world are changing in ways that we've never seen, to a degree we're not prepared for, and at speeds that we've never experienced. It is also clear that the thinking of the past will no longer be enough, and we can no longer wait for normal and the good old days to return. My guest today is New York Times bestselling author Gregg Braden. He's internationally renowned as a pioneer in bridging science, ancient wisdom, and the real world. Following a successful career as a computer geologist during the 1970s energy crisis, he worked as a senior computer systems designer with Martin Marietta Defense Systems during the final years of the Cold War. In 1991, he became the first technical operations manager for Cisco Systems. For more than 27 years, Gregg has explored high mountain villages, remote monasteries, and forgotten texts to merge their timeless secrets with the best science of today. His discoveries are now shared in 33 countries and 38 languages through such paradigm-inspiring books as The God Code, The Divine Matrix, Fractal Time, Deep Truth, and his latest book, The Turning Point. Gregg's work has been shared on every continent of the world, and in recent years he has presented his seminars and trainings to Fortune 500 companies, the U.S. military, international businesses, and is now featured in media specials on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, ABC, and NBC. Now, when I recorded this interview with Gregg, he was in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, and I was in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. So we had a few technical difficulties during the call, and the call got dropped a couple of times. So bear with us, there'll be a couple of pauses, but Gregg's wisdom shines through. Now here's my interview with Gregg Braden. Hello, Gregg. Welcome to the show.
Craig, I am thrilled to be on the program today. Thank you so much for having me as your guest.
I'm enthralled with the book, The Turning Point, and basically because it goes into deep what we're going through as a world, as a people, as human beings in this time. And you start off at the beginning of the book going through the problems we're facing, these crises we're going through, economic debt, population is growing out of control. Seems like the climate issues we're going through, energy issues we're going through, oil, coal, nuclear issues that we're going through. And it gets so overwhelming. And as a reader, I just think, what can I do about this? This seems so out of my control, out of my hands. And a lot of what you say in the book that I want to get into is that we can solve our problems based upon the way we think of ourselves and the world. And you actually have a quote here. It says, "Our willingness to think differently about ourselves and the world will be the key to our success." And I wonder if you could at least start off, what do you mean by that? And how can I, as an individual with all these massive problems in the world, have any sort of impact just by thinking differently?
Well, sure, Craig. And I'm going to take about a half a step backward before we actually identify those different ways of thinking. Just to clarify, the purpose of the book, the best minds of our time are telling us that we're living what is being called the time of extremes. And I want to be really clear. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all bad things that are happening or even good things. But big things, big shifts in the world, big changes in our lives are impacting us in a way that this generation has never seen, our parents and their parents never saw. So we don't have a good blueprint. We don't have a good a guidebook to really help us navigate our way through the extremes that we're seeing today. So I think it's fair to say that our world is changing, and it's changing in ways we've never seen, and that means our lives are changing in ways that we're simply not used to. And I think that's really important. It doesn't mean that it's all bad or good. It just means we're not used to it, and for most people, it's happening faster than we've been prepared to accept. And that means that we must live and think differently than we have at any other time in the past. And it's because there is so much information out there that I wanted to write this book, to cut through a lot of the misinformation. And I, like everyone else, we can be overwhelmed if we are relying on information that is not based in solid science and solid facts. And when we really get down to the science and the facts, there's actually a lot of good news and a lot of reasons for hope in terms of where we're going. So I like to refer frequently. There's a quote from E.O. Wilson, is a living evolutionary biologist. I just have tremendous respect for this man. He calls himself a biologist. In addition to that, I think he's a great visionary. And what he says is that we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. And I think that's such a powerful statement to begin with, because it's so true. We're overwhelmed. We're inundated with all kinds of information. Much of it is contradictory information. But he goes on in his quote. And the reason that I'm sharing this is because what he says will lay the foundation for everything we do in our talk here today. He says, we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. But he said, but the world from this point forward will be run by people that he calls synthesizers. And synthesizers are people that are able to put together just the right information, just the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely. And that's the end of the quote. And I think that describes each of us, where we are in our lives today. It's no longer enough to be an expert in one topic and to know a lot about just one thing. We've got to know a little bit about a lot of different things and have the skills to pull all that information together and apply it in our lives in a way that is useful, in a way that makes sense. And that's the way this book was written. We're covering a lot of information because that's the way we live our lives. We don't live in a vacuum. So yes, the big things are happening in the world, and we know we can't necessarily fix the world. But I think it begins by being honest, Craig. I mean, the question I ask is, how can we adapt to the extremes in our lives? How can we become resilient to the changes that we're being asked to make if we're not honest with ourselves about those changes? So that, I just want to be clear up front, that is the reason I went through and identified in broad brushstrokes some of the fundamental factors that have changed our world and changed our lives. Climate is certainly one of them. The economy is one of them. The way we share resources that are diminishing very quickly, social change. Those things are all important. And we can no longer separate them, those big things happening halfway around the world, from what's happening in our living room. What happens with energy halfway around the world affects the price that we pay for food in the grocery store and put on the table for our families, and our ability to get back and forth to work, and transportation costs and things like that. It's the ripple effect. So all of these things are laying the foundation for the way that we see our lives today. And within that context, now that's the context for which each of us are living our lives. To answer the question now that you've just asked, we have been taught to solve our problems through the way we think of ourselves and our relationship to the world. And this is important because for 300 years, we have been steeped in the scientific way of thinking about ourselves and the world, which can be a good thing if the science is honored. So I'm just going to stop here. I want to say that I am a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist. I've worked in the corporations and the technical and scientific realms of the corporations, and I was a geologist during the oil crisis in the 70s. I was senior computer systems designer of the defense industry during the Cold War nuclear crisis, the Cold War in the 80s. I was first technical operations manager with Cisco Systems in the information sharing crisis in the early 90s. So I've been in the world where we use the science that we've been taught to try to solve the problems that arrive at our doorstep. I think science is good, and I also am really clear that science does not have all the answers. And for science to serve us, we've got to keep science honest. And that's why I talk about in the book where science has been hijacked by corporations, by politicians, by religions, and the scientific information has been cherry-picked to support certain viewpoints that really are not honest when it comes to us dealing with the big problems in our lives today. So this is where the new discoveries come in, new discoveries that overturn 300 years of scientific thinking and what most of us have been taught in terms of the way we think of ourselves and our relationship to the world. So I think the thing to do maybe is to identify those, but I'm going to stop. We just covered a lot of ground in a short period of time to lay the foundation. I'm just going to ask you, Craig, does it make sense? Is there anything you'd like to develop more before we go into those new discoveries that help us to think differently?
No, let's keep going. I think you explained it brilliantly in just 5 minutes. I mean, it's a hard subject to try to digest, but I think we're on a good track here.
Well, it can be hard, or it can be very simple. And this is one of the reasons people try to, my experience, they often shy away from science because they believe it's something that they cannot comprehend, they can't understand, that it's complex. And I'd like to share with our listeners, science is simple, and it's based upon nature, and nature is simple until we make it complex with the language that we use to describe it and the mathematics that we use to describe certain principles. It can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. The ideas are really very simple. So when we begin to embrace the changes from that perspective, it gives us a foundation for ways to think differently. So what I describe in the book, now to answer your question specifically, there are 6 questions that are called the perennial questions of life. And these are the 6 questions that any organization, any civilization that has ever asked people to trust them, to believe in them, and to follow them, has had to find answers for these 6 questions for credibility. Whether it's ancient Rome, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it is a spiritual path from another time, these questions have to be answered. And science now has tried to do the same thing for 300 years. So quickly, let me just identify the 6 questions and what science has told us in the past and what the new discoveries now are telling us today. So if our listeners can envision an upside-down pyramid, an inverted pyramid, so the point is at the bottom, and this pyramid, it becomes the lens through which we see the world and we think of ourselves and our relationship to the world. And it's upon this inverted pyramid that these 6 questions appear, beginning at the bottom. The most fundamental question, number 1, what is the origin of life? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the origin of human life? Because there are many lines of thinking that human life did not originate the same place that other life originated from. The third question, what is our relationship to our bodies? Are we separate and powerless when it comes to the way our bodies function and healing our bodies? They have a mind of their own. Or do we somehow have the ability to influence? So not manipulate and not control, but can we influence the way our bodies function in the world? The third question, what is our relationship to the world beyond our bodies? Are we separate and powerless from the world that surrounds us? Or are we somehow connected to that world? The next question is, what is our relationship to the past? Is the civilization and the time, that we live in now, are we the most sophisticated technology and technological civilization that's ever existed, or are we the last in a long line of cycles of civilization? And that's an important question to ask. And the 6th question is, how do we solve our problems when things get tough? Do we believe in competition and conflict and survival of the strongest, or is there another way? So these are what are called the 6 keys of life, the 6 perennial questions. In a story about ourselves and our relationship to the world that is based on separation, and that is the scientific story for 300 years. We say science began maybe 300 years ago around the time of Isaac Newton, when Newton formalized the laws of physics. That's what we say that the scientific method began. So for 300 years, science has tried to answer these questions, and they have answered them in the following way. They've told us that the origin of life is random, the origin of human life is random, that our relationship to our body is that we are separate from our body, that we are powerless when it comes to influencing the way our body functions, the healing of our body, and longevity. When it comes to our relationship to the world, we're told that we're separate and independent from the world. What we do in our living room has very little effect on the world outside of our living room. We've been taught that civilization is linear. It's a one-way progression, beginning about 5,000 years ago with ancient Sumeria, and now it has reached this pinnacle of iPads, iPhones, and internet that we see today. We're told that we're the most advanced technological civilization ever to exist on the face of the earth. And the sixth question is based in Darwin's ideas. The answer to the sixth question is based in Darwin's ideas that were introduced in 1859. Darwin told us that we live in a world of competition and conflict, and that nature is based upon survival of the strongest. Okay? So that is, in effect, what is being taught in the classrooms today. There are exceptions, and it is changing slowly, but that is largely what's being taught today to our young people. It's what you and I were taught when we were in public schools, if we were educated in the West, and most of our listeners. The problem with this way of thinking is that every one of these ideas that I just shared has been scientifically determined to be false in the late 1990s and late part of the 20th century into the 21st century. This is peer-reviewed science is telling us is overturned every one of these. Peer-reviewed science is now telling us beyond any reasonable doubt that the origin of life is not random, the origin of human life is not random, that we are deeply connected to our bodies, that we are deeply connected to the earth, that civilization is cyclic, and we have had advanced technological civilizations here in the past, going back into the last ice age, and that competition and conflict happens only in specific circumstances, that nature is based upon a rule of cooperation and what is called mutual aid. So the story, Craig, has changed from a story of separation and powerlessness to the story of union, connectedness, and empowerment. And that's important because the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of our relationship to one another and the earth and the world around us is the lens through which we will solve our problems. So we go back and look at our time of extremes, whether it's the global economy, whether it's social breakdown in the Middle East, Israel and Iran, Iraq, what's happening there right now, what's happening, with Egypt and the Arab Springs, and all the things that are in Africa, or what's happening in China right now, or what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine. Whatever we're talking about, we are seeing the result of 300 years of separation thinking and solving our problems in terms of survival of the strongest now since 1859. And the way we've gone about solving those problems isn't working. It's no longer serving us. And that's why I'm saying it's important to embrace the facts of the science, because the science now is giving us new reasons to think differently about ourselves, and that gives us new ways to go about solving our problems. So I just want to say something quickly about science, because we get my office gets a lot of emails and texts and queries about this. There's a difference between what is called pop science and peer-reviewed science. And I'd like to clarify what that difference is. Any scientist can write an article or write a paper, put it up on the internet. And I think our listeners know you can write anything on the internet these days. And maybe the scientist does work for NASA, by day, or maybe he does work for the Jet Propulsion Labs or whatever it is. He can write something that his opinion, that is his opinion, put on the internet, and it doesn't mean it's true. That's his opinion. Peer-reviewed science is when a scientist does the research, writes the paper, and under the auspices usually of a research organization, although not always, or university, and then that paper is circulated to peers. And the peers are asked to examine this paper with a fine-tooth comb to find out where the holes in the theory might be, to find out where the ideas are broken, or where they're supported, either way. And it is circulated among peers, and it is a time, well, it takes a lot of time to do these. It's often, 5, 6, 7, 8 years it can take for a peer review process to finish. And then the paper is published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That's different than just posting it on the Internet. The reason I'm saying this is because I've just made a couple of big claims here. And my claims are based on peer-reviewed science. One of them is random, that we're separate from our bodies, separate from the world, that civilization is linear, and nature is based on survival of the strongest. Every one of those is a false assumption, and peer-reviewed science is telling us that. So if we want to be honest with ourselves, it always reminds me of the movie with Jack Nicholson where he says, can you handle the truth? Or he says, you can't handle the truth. The question is, can we handle the truth? We're asking science to solve big problems in our lives and in our world. Science has now given us the answers. Are we willing to embrace the deepest truth that science has offered and incorporate those into our worldview and into our way of thinking? We go about solving our problems. And we can give some specific examples as we go on, but I'm going to stop there and let the interviewer do his job, and just see where we are here. But that's a long answer to a very short first question.
Well, what I really like about your book, you turn kind of a negative into a positive with the word crisis. And you say in the book, the word crisis doesn't necessarily mean that something bad is happening. And, as you're talking about the science, this word popped into my head. And it's like, yeah, I guess we're going through a lot of stuff. But as we change the way we're thinking, maybe crisis doesn't necessarily mean something bad is going to happen.
Well, I think crisis, it can mean that, doesn't have to. Crisis, usually where we see crisis is when something that we have become accustomed to in the past, a way of doing things, a way of solving problems, a way of functioning, something that has worked in the past isn't working now. And when it stops working, we say there's a problem, there's a crisis. And the reason that so many of the systems are breaking down in our lives today, and we've talked about some of these, whether it's the way we deal with energy or the economy is one that everybody is aware of now because it affects everybody's livelihoods and their bank accounts. So I'm going to go back to this inverted pyramid and these ideas, this lens through which we think of ourselves in the world. And I share this in live audiences a lot, and people say, okay, Gregg, that's cool, it's very interesting. So what? What difference does it make? Darwin, for example, he wrote his book in 1859, and here we are in the 21st century. So what difference could it possibly make in our lives today? And it's a really good question. And the answer surprises people. But the book, Darwin's book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, that was first published in 1859. And that's where he introduced the idea of survival of the strongest. And those are his own words, a quote right out of his book. It was later interpreted as survival of the fittest. But Darwin's own words were survival of the strongest. So 1859 is between the mid-1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. That is when the basis of our society was being formed and our modern Western civilization was being formed. And science was relatively young during that time. So Darwin's ideas were embraced quickly, and there wasn't much question. Because he was a scientist, people embraced his ideas, and they were incorporated into the way our society is built. So the economic system, for example, that is buckling and collapsing on a global basis right now, even though we're putting Band-Aids on it and we've got a couple of crutches and a cast here and there, it's not in good health. it is based in this idea of survival of the strongest. And because that is a false assumption, the economic system is unsustainable in its present form. So this is a perfect example of where the ideas from over 100 years ago are impacting our lives right now. The way that we share vital resources that are disappearing, whether it's oil or gas or whether it's water, which is becoming a rare commodity in some parts of the world. With a growing population, diminishing resources, how do we go about dealing with that? The old way of thinking says the survival of the strongest. So there are the rich, powerful nations are taking what they need, and other nations are going without. That is unsustainable. And it's unsustainable in societies, and societies are breaking down. People are taking to the streets. Entire economies are collapsing now because of that. So suddenly these ideas become important to us because they're affecting our lives today. And the good news is that the same science that tells us those are false ideas give us the new ways of thinking. And those new ways of thinking, now we have the opportunity to embrace those into the changes and into the solutions that we're making in our lives today. So, for example, the best science of the 20th and now the 21st century is telling us that nature is actually based upon the model of what is called cooperation and mutual aid. Scientists are honest. They say, yes, there is violent competition that does happen sometimes in nature, but it happens in response to specific circumstances. It's not the general rule. And when we begin to look at solving the big problems of what's happening in the Middle East, or how we're dealing with diminishing resources of food and water and energy, and we begin to think about solving that problem through the lens of cooperation and mutual aid rather than competition and conflict, it opens the door, Craig, to a whole array, a vast array of possibilities that have not been considered in the past. And I think to a really vital, uplifting, life-affirming message of hope and possibility for our future that we haven't seen much of because people tend to look at the gloom and the doom. So that is one example, this idea. I'll just go back to Darwin for a minute because I don't want to leave our listeners with any false impressions here. So I have a lot of respect for Charles Darwin, and I think he was a scientist. We know that. My opinion is I think he was a good scientist. And Darwin attempted to do something in 1859 that had never been done before. So before he wrote his book, Origin of the Species, all of these big perennial questions, where does life come from? Where's human life come from? You know, what's our relationship to our bodies and the world? How do things work? How do we solve our problems? Those questions were all answered largely in the religious context. They were answered by the church. And you had to follow the rules of the church and live in families and in community society based on the rules the church had established in trying to answer these questions. Darwin, as a scientist, said, I am going to make an attempt to move this way of thinking away from a religious context. He said, we're going to answer these through science. And he said, what I'm offering is only the first step. And he said, Darwin said this, he said, the first time someone finds new information that overturns my theory will fall. He was willing for his theories to fall. He said, and then the new theories will tell us where we go next. So in 1859, Darwin was willing to allow his theories to fall when new scientific discoveries overturned his theories. So in 1859, he said, I'm offering this theory of evolution to get us off the mark, away from the church in answering these questions through the lens of religion. And he said, this will help us in that direction. I'm paraphrasing. And he said, the first time that a discovery is made that overturns my theory will fall, and that new discovery then shows the way of where we need to look, of what the research needs to, the form the research needs to take. So Darwin was willing for his theories to fall, Modern academia, now in the early 21st century, is still clinging to the original ideas. They're not willing for the theories to fall. They are not willing for the new science to show us where to look. And this is where I say science has been hijacked by academia, by corporate interests. Darwin offered a theory, and I'm just using this as an example, but it's a good example. Darwin offered a theory of evolution, and science has tried to make the data, the fossils that have been discovered, and the relationships that have been established. They've tried to fit those ideas into the theory rather than allowing the ideas to show us what the new relationships are all about. That's a very different way of thinking about science. Trying to make, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. It's where you have a pre-established idea, and then all the data you try to make fit that idea into that idea, rather than allowing the data to show the story that is truly unfolding. So this is one of the examples where this idea, these new discoveries are so powerful, they're so important because they're changing the way we think of ourselves and our relationship to the world. So, and that's one specific. When we could talk about cyclic civilizations that go back in the last ice age and the advanced technologies of mathematics and astronomy and how they understood things that we're only beginning to understand now. We could talk about the implications of thought, feeling, emotion, and belief. The heart-brain relationship that releases the chemistry into our bodies that heals us very, very quickly and creates powerful immune response and anti-aging hormones. We could talk about all of those, and I do in the book. But each of those, the fact that those new discoveries have now overturned 300 years of scientific thinking, Craig, it gives us the reasons to think differently about ourselves and our relationship to the world. And when it comes, now we come full circle. When it comes to the big changes in the world, our time of extremes, it gives us the foundation to adapt and create resilience to the changes in our lives. And that was the reason that I went through in the first couple of chapters of the book to factually state what we know about the changes. Because what it tells us is that the changes, what we see as the changes, have actually become the new normal in our lives. We are living a new normal that has blossomed and is now at our doorstep within the same lifetime where we used to live a different way. So commonly, these kinds of changes, it's called a sea change. A sea change is common from one generation to the next. What's so unusual here is that we are a generation that has learned one way of living and thinking and being and the technology that supports it. And now we are being asked, it's like the rug has been pulled out from under us. And we're being asked to live and think very, very differently within just a few years of when we thought we had it all figured out and mastered from another way of thinking and living. So this is important for us to acknowledge is that a new normal has emerged, and the extremes that I've identified are the normal for our lifetimes, probably for our children's lifetimes. Climate change, for example, is a perfect example. The climate is not going back to where it was 10 years ago. And there are a lot of ideas and controversies about what's causing the climate change and our role in it, and I do address that in the book, and we can talk about that here as well. But the point is, we can change all the light bulbs we want, we can drive smaller cars. I think it's good to do those things, but don't fool ourselves. Be honest with ourselves. We're not going to force the climate, the weather patterns, the temperature variations. We're not going to force those back to where they were 10 years ago. So we can act surprised every time there's a big storm. We can be caught off guard when we see these weather extremes, or we can embrace the fact that there is a new normal and we are in a time of climate extremes and live our lives in a way so that we adapt to those changes. Bury the power cables under the earth so that they're protected rather than putting them on top of vulnerable telephone poles that are going to get blown down every time we have a big storm that happens in the hurricane season every year. Stop building homes and schools next to the river on a floodplain where we know the rivers are going to go out of their banks every year because we're living a time of extremes. So, I mean, those are examples on a community level. But where we really focus on the book is going from community into the personal level, how we can adapt our thinking and our living, creating the resilience to these extremes. And I think this is where it really comes home for people, because they can really identify with, what those are all about. So how are we doing so far?
Oh, we're doing great, and I think this is a perfect point to kind of get into the next kind of wave that we need to get into as people, and you brought it down to the personal level. And there's a quote by you, and you say, "We may find that the same power that heals our deepest hurts and creates peace between nations holds the key to our survival as a species." And in the book, A Turning Point, you're talking about some of these false assumptions that science has made and the facts. And a couple of the facts you point out are, one, our emotions directly influence what happens in the sea of energy we are bathed in. And two, the universe, our world, and our bodies are made of a shared field of energy, a matrix that makes the unity known as entanglement possible. So it seems like this new knowledge, this new way of thinking, we have these ideas. We may find that the same power that heals our deepest hurts and creates peace between nations holds the key to our survival. How do we use that? I kind of get it, but I don't understand how to use this matrix, this entanglement, to create a better life for myself, a better life for my family, and a better world.
Sure. And later in chapters of the book, we go into that in specifics and actually give exercises in the book. And for our listeners, what I'll say right now, it may not even be fair to even try to do this in a few minutes in a radio program. And I think we can at a very high level, we can do this. So here's the context. We're living in a world of big change. A new normal is here, and the key to us thriving, and I'm not talking about just clinging by by our fingernails to some thread of normalcy in our lives, waiting for everything to get back to normal. What I'm talking about is learning to thrive in the extremes. What we're now seeing is the extremes, and we do that by adapting to the extremes and by creating the resilience in our lives. So this idea of resilience, it's a really interesting word. I've just come back from a tour in Europe, and I won't mention the country, but I'll say I was working with a translator in another language on stage, and I had introduced the concept of resilience. And this is a translation where I speak, and then I pause, and then they translate, and then they pause, and I speak. But it actually is pretty lively. It's a very lively exchange. We have a lot of fun, a lot of jokes, a lot of fun with the language. So the man is on stage with me, and I'm talking about resilience, and he's translated, and all of a sudden, he is in a conversation with the audience, a very heated conversation between the translator on the stage and the audience about the way he has just translated this word. And they're going back and forth and back. It's like I didn't even exist. I literally walked off the stage. But I walked off the stage to the green room, and I made a cup of tea, and I came back, and they were still going. I had hot water; it was already made. I just poured the tea in the tea bag and came back, and I said, "What in the world is going on?" And this is when I learned something that caught me completely off guard. There was no word in the language that I was speaking to, the people in the audience. There was no word that translates as resilience. The idea of resilience was not supported in the language with a single word. There are other words that they could string together to approximate the word, but there was no word for resilience. I'm just going to turn this around and give another example. In Sanskrit, there is a word that is called prana. And I think most of our listeners, if they're listening to this program, probably know what prana is. It is a specific word in Sanskrit for an energy, a field of energy that permeates the body and connects us to the world around us. In the English language, we don't have a word that translates into prana. So what we have to do is put other words together to approximate prana. So we call it life force, for example. We take two unrelated words and we put those together to approximate the and it doesn't even do it justice, really. The word prana is so much deeper than simply life force. But I'm using that as an example in the other way. In the English language, there's no word for a Sanskrit term. So what I'm saying is in many other languages, there are no words for in English what we call resilience, and that surprised me. The idea of resilience, if you look this up in a textbook, it is the ability to bounce back or to spring back to a normal functioning after there has been some kind of a tragedy. So personal resilience, a family has to find personal resilience after the loss of their son or their daughter in the battlefield of Afghanistan, for example. The family has to find the resilience to continue with their lives. Or on a community level, Hurricane Sandy devastated entire communities. They had to find the resilience to move forward with their lives and to rebuild and to keep going. So this idea of resilience in the past, Craig, it's been about getting back to a normal functioning after something happens, something bad happens. I think that's good. I think it has served us all. My question as I was writing the book, is there another kind of resilience that goes beyond springing back or bouncing back? And the answer is yes. The Stockholm Resilience Institute is now exploring something that is called expanded resilience. Expanded resilience is where we learn to think and live every day, embracing the world as it is, embracing our lives as they are, the facts of the world in our lives, so that we don't have to bounce back, we don't have to spring back, because we've already incorporated the extremes into our way of thinking. And that is a lot of what this book is all about. When we are honest with ourselves, with our families, with our communities, on a national level, on a global level, that we are living a time of extremes. The mainstream media has never done this. So they look at each individual extreme as something that's broken. So they look at the economy in a vacuum and say, well, we just need to do this, we'll fix the economy. Or climate change. We just need to do this and we're going to fix climate change. Or, the tensions in the Middle East. If these people could just get together, then we could do this. When in reality, they are all facets of an even greater change that simply is not being acknowledged. So the idea, the first step, is for us to acknowledge that we are living this time of extremes, and in this time of extremes, to incorporate those extremes into the way we think and solve our problems. And I gave a couple of examples for communities. Communities would just think ahead a little bit, bury their power lines, stop building residences in a place that's going to flood every year, localize their sources of energy, localize their sources of where their food comes from, so that when the weather's bad and they're cut off, you can't make a delivery from the nearest big city to your town, you're okay because you've got things. They're common sense things. But a lot of communities are not doing that. So on a community level, these are examples of expanded resilience. On a personal level, we all have some form of resilience already because it's how we get through life. The idea is to raise the baseline of our resilience. And there are a number of different ways of going about doing that. There's an organization, the Institute of Heart Math. Have you interviewed the Heart Math people? Are you familiar with
I've interviewed Deborah Rosman. I'm actually going to interview her again in a couple of weeks, and Roland as well in the next year. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So Deborah Rosman is one of the VPs of the Institute of Heart Math, and Roland McCready is the chief research scientist. And for our listeners that may not be familiar with the organization, it is the Institute of Heart Math, H-E-A-R-T, capital M-A-T-H, but it's all one word. And they are a pioneering research organization, people from many different professions have come together to pool their intellect, to pool their resources to study the power of the human heart in unconventional ways. So these are medical doctors, computer scientists, physicists, physiologists. They've all come together to explore what it is that our heart actually does in our bodies beyond simply pumping blood. We all know it does that. They're very, very well respected. They're published in peer-reviewed journals. And I have worked with them. I'm not their employee, but I've worked with them for over 20 years in various projects as an independent author. And I'm mentioning them now because they have established the fact of this relationship between the heart and the brain and how we can strengthen the relationship between our heart and our brain in a way that raises our baseline of resilience. It helps us to adapt to change in our lives and our world in an even better way. So, Craig, can I talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, please. Yeah, go for it.
Go into this. One of the really interesting things, I think our listeners are all familiar with what a human heartbeat looks like. It used to be called an EKG. Now it's called an ECG. But it's the electrical printout of a heartbeat on a piece of paper. And we typically see a big spike, and then a couple of little spikes, another big spike, and then a few more little ones, another one, a little one. And we are accustomed to thinking that the distance between each of those spikes, the bump, 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 bump that you hear in a heartbeat, that the distance on the paper between each spike is pretty much the same, or the time between each of those beats that we hear with our ears is pretty much the same. They're close, but they are not exactly the same. There is a variability between each heartbeat, and it's a good thing that there is a variability because that is where our resilience comes from. The more variability there is between each of those heartbeats, the greater resilience we have in our lives, the better we are able to embrace change and deal with change. And it makes perfect sense if we think about it like this. When we're young, when we first come into this world, it's a new world, we're exploring, we've got to figure things out fast, we have to react quickly. And the distance between each heartbeat on a young person, it's called heart rate variability, HRV. So the heart rate variability, when we're young, there's a tremendous heart rate variability. The time between each beat, almost every beat, is going to be different from the one before and the one after it. And it is that variability that gives us the ability to respond quickly to our world and to make changes, and we need to. As we get older, we become more rigid in our thinking, and we expect the world to behave in certain ways. We often hear the term that as we get older, we are set in our ways. I think we've all heard that before, become set in our ways. As we become set in our ways, more rigid in our thinking, Craig, it's actually reflected in our heartbeat. Our heartbeat becomes more regular. We lose the heart rate variability, and that makes change more difficult for us. So now we're going back to big picture, in our time of global extremes that are affecting our local lives, in our families, in our communities, in our workplace, big changes in our lives, what we would most want is to be able to have more heart rate variability, to be able to respond quickly and embrace big changes. And the good news is that no matter how old we are, you can regain that heart rate variability that we had when we were young through simple techniques. And heart math is, in the laboratory, they're actually confirming and validating many of the techniques that have been shared through the indigenous peoples throughout the years that have gone through change. They didn't do it scientifically, but they told us the key is to get into our hearts. Well, science for many years has discounted that because they believe that the action is in the human brain. And now what we're finding is that it's not only the brain by itself, and it's not only the heart by itself, but it's the union of the heart and the brain working together in harmony as a unified system. It is the heart-brain complex. As we can tune our heart and our brain together in very specific ways, then that gives us greater heart rate variability. That gives us more resilience to change, and it's also really good for our health. So it works like this. Every moment of every day, there's a conversation between our heart and our brain. Our heart is sending signals to our brain, and our brain is sending signals back to our heart. There are many more signals coming from the heart to the brain. And what the research is actually showing is, while the brain is certainly an important organ in our body, it is the heart that sends the instructions that tell the brain what to do. So the way we feel in our heart determines what kind of signal our heart sends to our brain. When we feel a sense of well-being or positive experiences of appreciation, gratitude, care, compassion, for example, that sends one kind of signal to the brain, and the brain releases a chemistry into our bodies that matches that. So appreciation, gratitude, care, compassion, well-being, we feel safe. The brain releases the chemistry, anti-aging hormones kick up. Our immune response becomes very, very powerful. The SIGA, this is the first line of the immune response in human saliva, increases tremendously in the presence of these kinds of emotions. And the stress hormones decrease, 23% decrease in cortisol after only 3 minutes of these positive emotions, while the DHEA levels, the precursor to all the hormones in the body, they increase 100% in those same 3 minutes. And all we're doing is having a good feeling. But it's a very specific kind of feeling focused in the heart. And there are techniques that Heart Math describes. I describe some in the book as well that help us to move and focus in our heart as we're holding these techniques. And what's so interesting about the science, Craig, is that the science tells us we don't have to guess. There's a specific frequency between the heart and the brain when we are in optimal communication. So the communication is called coherence. And optimum coherence between the heart and the brain is a very low frequency, 0.10 hertz. 0.10 hertz, really low frequency. So when we feel the feelings that create 0.10 hertz, we are tuning our heart and our brain together into a unified system that not only is good for our health, for our immune system, for the aging or anti-aging process in our bodies, but it also prepares us to embrace change in a healthy way and to deal with change in a healthy way. And in our time of extremes, that's where the resilience comes from. So in a really beautiful way, we come full circle. Big changes in the world. Science is now confirming what our most ancient and cherished traditions have told us about the power of connecting the heart and the brain together. And the same science is telling us that when we tune our bodies in that way, we are actually preparing ourselves in a healthy way to embrace the new normal that is now at our doorstep so that we can thrive in the new world that is emerging. And that is the essence of what the book, The Turning Point, is all about.
Gregg, we've been going for about 50 minutes, 55 minutes, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much great information in the book, and I'm going to have to let you go because I know you have other people you need to talk to, but I want everybody to know that you can find out more about Gregg, more about his work and his books, his audio programs, videos, all sorts of stuff on GreggBraden.com. And Gregg is with 3 G's. It's GreggBraden. And if you go to the bottom of his webpage on the left, you'll see links to Facebook and Twitter and his YouTube channel. But lots of great information. Take some time and look around his website. Gregg, you're all over the world. You mentioned being in Europe, and you do everything from evening seminars to weekend workshops to week and 2-week-long trips to Peru and Mexico and Tibet and all sorts of things. And it's great stuff. So certainly go to his events and see when he's going to be appearing somewhere near you. And Gregg, I just, there's so much to talk about, and I have, I think I asked 3 out of my tons of questions, and it's just so much stuff. And I so appreciate the work you do. You have so many great books, and certainly pick up the Turning Point and any other book that Gregg has. You can find them on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and your local bookstore. So, Gregg, thank you so much for your time. I know you got a busy media day today, so I appreciate you taking some time for me. And
well, Craig, you're important. You are on my schedule. I am doing a series of interviews. It's a media day today, but I want to thank you for the work you do, Craig. Just for your dedication, your vision in this kind of programming. I think we all know it'd be a lot easier not to do a program, and it's through media like this that we get to have these kinds of conversations that you don't often find in mainstream. And I think it's important for our community. And as we reach beyond our community in the mainstream, I think the language of science doesn't have to be science that we talk about, but the language of science is a language that's trusted and it's respected. And if we're going to reach deep into the mainstream for the kind of change that we all feel that the world is needing right now, I think it's important to do it in a language that is trusted and respected. Right now, it is that language of science, but it doesn't have to be complicated, because as I mentioned before, I think science is very simple. So I want to thank all of our listeners I'll just speak to you directly. I want to thank you for everything you're doing every day in your life to make this world a better place and to be just the best person that you can be in a world where a lot of really beautiful things are happening right now. So until next time, Craig, thank you so much, and I do look forward to the next time.
Thank you so much, Gregg, for all you're doing.
You're very welcome. Come and say hello to me.
I'll do. All right. See you, Gregg.
Take care. Bye-bye.